Okay. All right, everybody, welcome to our third Student Advocacy Day event, where, as you know, the Student Advocacy Days bring our seminars together to learn, share, and find ways to put advocacy into action. You may have heard we are recording this, mostly because there are many students at seminars who have difficulty getting into this time slot. So we want to make sure that they're able to see the information. And for those of you who may want to review it, it will be posted later on SAR's YouTube channel. Today's panel is Governmental Avenues for Raising Awareness, and it features Scott Busby, someone who I've known since I was 20 years old, who has had a long time commitment to human rights and working on behalf of people who are persecuted by and for their ideas, and as well as a distinguished career in government that's included positions in the Clinton and Obama White Houses. And he currently serves in the, I can't remember the long title now, as the deputy, acting principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in Democracy, Rights, and Labor at the Department of State, of which I'll leave it to Scott to talk more about that. Scott will have a presentation, brief presentation, and then we'll have time for questions. So please welcome Scott Busby.
Great, thank you, Adam, and welcome everyone. What I'm going to do today is give you a presentation about the work that DRL does, because I think it's a good primer on how the US government does human rights advocacy, into which your own advocacy will fit. And I'm also going to give you a little bit of an overview of the State Department as well, so you understand kind of what role the Human Rights Bureau within the State Department has. So here's the name of our bureau, as Adam just described it, along with our mission. And I won't read through that mission, but you'll see that it's all about promoting American values, individual rights, and demonstrating really that the promotion of human rights and protection of human rights is part and parcel of our efforts to promote a stable, prosperous, and secure world. And we believe strongly that there is a very strong link between respect for human rights and these other goals of our foreign policy. Next slide, please. This is, I hope it's just bigger on your screen than on mine. This is a org chart of the overall State Department. I wanted to show this to you before I talked about DRL, so you kind of understand where we fit into things. I should first note that this is an org chart current as of February 2020, so it's about a year old, but it is largely still accurate. You can obviously see all the key leadership positions at the top here. For your awareness, the only confirmed political appointee we have right now in the State Department is the secretary, but we are hoping to get 2 deputies soon, as well as some other folks. One of the key things I want to point out to you about the State Department is to the far left of this screen, under the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. These are our so-called regional bureaus and the Bureau of International Affairs. And these are first among equals in bureaus in the State Department, because these are the bureaus that oversee all of our embassies and consulates and missions around the world. So the day-to-day diplomacy is primarily overseen by each of these entities. The world is divided up into 6 regions by the State Department for these purposes. And a lot of the work that we do internally and that you may do in your external roles is trying to influence these regional bureaus, because all equities that the State Department may be seeking to advance in any given country or region is covered by those particular bureaus. Next, and go ahead, Adam, go back to the org chart for a second. The other thing I want to point out is sort of where we fit in. I mean, as you move to the right, you'll see all sorts of bureaus that dealing with management issues, but bureaus that do not have responsibility for particular regions are what we call functional bureaus. And DRL, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, is one such functional bureau. And we are way to the right here under the Undersecretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Civilian Security. May have gotten that title wrong. So as I explained earlier, the role that DRL plays within the State Department is by and large trying to ensure that the rest of the State Department is adequately paying attention to democracy, human rights, and labor issues. The bulk of our advocacy, though, and work is with the regional bureaus, because again, they are the ones who are day to day integrating together all of the diplomatic objectives that the US government may have in a given country or in a given region. Next slide, please. Back to DRL now. Our overall goals are to basically advocate for those norms that were developed as a consequence or in the wake of World War II, to support others advocating for those norms. And those are a lot of the people that you all will be seeking to help. And then we have a variety of statutory and legal obligations that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. The ways in which we accomplish these objectives are through bilateral diplomacy, which means government-to-government diplomacy, means that we would be speaking directly to, say, the government of Uganda about a given case. Multilateral work, that is advocacy or diplomacy that we do in the context of the UN and other organizations that are made up of a variety of other governments. That's why it's called multilateral. As I mentioned, we like to demonstrate the connection between human rights, democracy, and security, peace, and prosperity. As I also already mentioned, a lot of our work is done by supporting individuals and organizations who are seeking to advance these same objectives. Next slide, please. These are some of the things that President Biden and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken have already said about the importance of human rights and democracy. They have regularly indicated that democracy and human rights should be at the center, is at the center of the Biden administration's foreign policy. So it has given us a great opportunity to provide even greater focus and priority to these issues in our diplomacy. And that should be good news to all of you who are seeking to advance the rights of particular individuals who may have their rights threatened. Next slide, please. Here are some of the links that have been demonstrated between democracy and peace. There's a particular study that we helped to fund demonstrating this, but there's lots of scholarship showing that countries that respect human rights and democracy are more peaceful and secure than countries that do not do so. Next slide, please. Similarly, there is a lot of academic work showing that there is a strong link between democracy and prosperity. And one relatively recent book called Why Nations Fail does a comprehensive analysis of why certain societies have succeeded in developing themselves economically and why others have not. And that book concludes that democratic institutions, rule of law, etc., are absolutely critical to long-term prosperity. Next slide, please. What are the origins of human rights? Human rights first stem from multiple religions, all of which emphasize the dignity of the individual. And that's why you see a lot of religiously oriented people among the leaders in human rights advocacy. There were, of course, many Enlightenment philosophers who specifically developed the concept of human rights, John Locke among them. Many of you have probably read these books. And then there's an interesting theory put forward by historian Lynn Hunt, arguing that the rise of the novel in the 18th century provided fertile ground for the concept of human rights, basically because the novel provided a sympathetic look at the plight of particular individuals. And she makes the case that this was fertile ground for the concepts that the French Revolution propagated. Next slide, please. Here's some other origins that'll be more familiar to you. Our Declaration of Independence, of course, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen from the French Revolution, and then the Bill of Rights that is part of our Constitution. Next slide, please. U.S. has been a key leader on human rights over the course of our history, despite our many challenges, and particularly in the wake of World War II, as many of you probably know, Eleanor Roosevelt, then the First Lady, played a critical role in developing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is really the bedrock of much of the work that our Bureau does and that the human rights advocacy community does. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s in the United States has been a model, an example of human rights advocacy that not only people in the United States, but people the world over continue to look to, as was the rights advocacy done on behalf of disabled people in the late 1960s, really until the present time. And for those of you who haven't seen it, there's a wonderful new documentary called Crip Camp, which chronicles the history of advocacy for the rights of disabled persons. Next slide, please. Here is a timeline of the various of the most important human rights documents and treaties, including those that we are party to, as well as those we're not party to. I don't think we need to go into each one. You probably heard of these before. Likely the two most important ones for your work are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and then the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which speaks to issues like arbitrary detention, invasion of privacy, due process, and things of that nature. Next slide, please. DRL was created in the 1970s in the wake of the Vietnam War, the human rights abuses that occurred in South America and places like Argentina and Chile, and abuses that occurred elsewhere in the world. And the Congress felt that rather than have only regional bureaus in the State Department that worried about overall diplomacy, there should be a bureau specifically devoted to the promotion and protection of human rights. So a specific coordinator for human rights was created in 1975 by the Congress. The Congress then mandated that the department do an annual country report on human rights practices in every country in the world. Those still exist and hopefully should be a resource for all of you. And our bureau was actually formally created in 1977. Next slide, please. One of the other key things that Congress did at the same time as it created DRL was it wanted to demonstrate the link that there should be between respect for human rights and foreign assistance. And so to this day, this is a provision in our law that basically says we should not provide foreign assistance to any government which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. And you can see what the definition of gross violation of internationally recognized human rights there is at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. President Reagan also played a key role in advancing democracy and human rights in US foreign policy, in particular with a famous speech he gave at Westminster in 1982, where he talked about the importance of promoting freedom and democracy to US foreign policy. Next slide, please. One of the things he did in this speech was he announced the creation of a number of entities to advance human rights, which are part of the so-called National Endowment for Democracy. This is a institution which is funded by the US Congress, but is independent of the executive branch. So we work with NED, but they are separate from us. And as part of the NED family, there are two institutes, the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, both of which are affiliated with the two major political parties in the United States. CIPE is the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is primarily focused on promoting the rules that allow private enterprise to flourish overseas. And then the Solidarity Center, which focuses on labor rights overseas. Next slide, please. There are a variety of other laws that also address human rights. One of the other more important ones is the International Religious Freedom Act, which created an ambassador at large for international religious freedom, a separate office dedicated to those issues, a separate set of reports on religious freedom in countries around the world. So those reports are distinct from the annual country reports that DRL produces. And the law also requires each year that the Secretary of State indicate which countries are of particular concern when it comes to religious freedom. Next slide, please. Another key law guiding our work is the so-called Leahy Law, which provides that no assistance should be furnished to any unit of security forces in a country if the Secretary of State has credible information that such a unit has committed a gross violation of human rights. Hearkening back to the 502B, which I alluded to in an earlier slide, which provides for the termination of assistance to any country engaged in gross violations of human rights, it was discovered that that law was not very frequently applied. So Senator Leahy and his team developed this law, which precludes assistance flowing to particular security force units in a given country rather than to the country as a whole. And as a consequence of this law, our Bureau has to vet every person and/or unit that is receiving US foreign assistance to make sure that that individual or unit is not implicated in gross violations of human rights. Next slide, please. Some of the other things we do related to human rights are the vetting of munitions, transfers, and sales. So in other words, when we are selling weapons to a country, let's say Saudi Arabia, for instance, we are committed to evaluating whether or not those weapons could be used in perpetrating human rights abuses or other violations of international humanitarian law. This is a policy that the new administration is looking to strengthen in the near term. DRL is also a key player in the Atrocity Prevention Board, which was created in the Obama administration, which is committed to trying to prevent mass atrocities from occurring. Next slide, please. Another law that is relevant to DRL is the Child Soldiers Prevention Act. This law requires that we identify any government involved in the unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers, and it actually provides that certain types of security assistance should not be provided to those countries that are using or recruiting child soldiers into their security forces. Next slide, please. The Magnitsky Act is something else you may have heard about. It is named after a Russian lawyer, an accountant, who worked for an American investor in Russia. Sergei Magnitsky sought to uncover some of the corruption he encountered in the course of his work, was imprisoned and died in prison. And as a consequence, his employer, a gentleman named Bill Browder, who many of you may have heard of, he's written a book that published not long ago called Red Notice, which is about many of these events. Bill Browder and others decided to pass a law, advocate for a law, which Congress eventually passed, that imposed economic sanctions on Russian officials believed to be responsible, first in the death of Sergei Magnitsky and the cover-up of the investigation into his death. And subsequently, the law was amended to apply to any Russian official involved in serious human rights violations. Next slide, please. That law has since been globalized. So we now have the authority to impose economic sanctions and visa restrictions on any person engaged in human rights abuses or acts of significant corruption. And there's lots of public attention and public debate around this law. Next slide, please. In addition, we have a number of laws and authorities that allow us to deny visas to people engaged in human rights abuses. And these are authorities that we are increasingly using as well. Next slide, please. DRL itself is broken down into regional offices that mirror the regional bureaus that I described earlier that make up sort of the core of the work the State Department does. Next slide, please. DRL also has a number of functional offices, just as the State Department has a number of functional bureaus. We have offices devoted to particular functional issues, which you can read here. Next slide, please. And here is contact information for DRL. You can visit the State Department website where DRL has its own page. That page includes a number of things relevant to DRL, press releases and the like. It is also a place where you can find the most recent country reports on human rights practices that I described earlier. And there's an email link there for those of you who may want to be in touch with the Bureau. Next slide, please. That's it for my slideshow. I know one of the things that Adam asked me to talk about are sort of what are the various government avenues for raising awareness about particular cases. Well, based on what I've just shown to you, obviously the State Department is the locus of a lot of the activity the United States government is doing in promoting human rights overseas. And so making my bureau aware of particular cases or the regional bureaus aware of particular cases is one way of making us aware of the cases that you might be working on. In most cases, my guess is we are already aware of such cases, but there's no harm in sending us a letter asking us to pay attention to a particular case and to do what we can to help that person. Congress obviously is another very, very important a governmental institution you should be trying to influence, and reaching out to members of the House of Representatives as well as the Senate is always useful and important. And there are some House members and members of the Senate who are particularly interested in human rights, but I would say the vast majority of them care about cases of people who have been wrongly detained or mistreated overseas. The last particular target, if I can use that word, for your advocacy should be the embassies of foreign governments, as well as those governments themselves. They're the ones who hold the keys, literally, to the places where the people you are advocating for are being imprisoned or held unjustly, and demonstrating to these governments that there are American citizens like you all who care about these cases can have a powerful impact. These governments are oftentimes hearing from us here in DRL, from our embassies, about our concerns about particular cases. But when these foreign governments understand that there may be lots of other Americans who care about these cases, I think that gives both greater impetus, greater force to our advocacy, as well as to the advocacy of other NGOs. So I think that is one of the most useful things that you all can do in your advocacy, is to collect petitions and forward those petitions to foreign embassies and to foreign governments, demonstrating that there is significant concern throughout the United States on particular cases. Why don't I stop there and open it up for questions and comments? Over to you, Adam.
Yeah, sure, Scott. I have one or two questions, and there's some coming up in the Q&A too. Just briefly, does the state liaise with the Lantos Commission?
Yes. Yeah. So the Lantos Commission regularly makes inquiries with us about what we're doing on particular cases, and the Lantos Commission regularly holds hearings on particular countries, particular issues, which they often ask DRL to appear at. So there is a lot of work between us and the Lantos Commission, and the Senate has now created a similar body to the Lantos Commission, specifically devoted to human rights. So they too are tracking the sorts of cases you're working on.
And one more question, then I want to go to a couple from the Q&A. I've been in a couple of meetings recently with people from different human rights advocates from different countries who talk particularly about they feel one of the great advocacy tools is the raising public awareness about what is going on in that country, with the implication that the authorities in those countries don't want to see their abuses being made public or in the media. Do you find that to be an effective tool?
Yes, all governments, in my experience, want to have a decent international reputation. In some cases, for very practical reasons, because they want various types of assistance from other governments, or they want investment, and they're not going to get those things if they have a bad reputation. But to be perfectly frank, they also care about looking good on the international stage. So the extent to which you all or anyone publicizes misdeeds, human rights violations that these governments are engaged in, it taints their reputation and gets their attention. So there's no question that that type of publicity gets under these governments' skin and can, on occasion, cause them to change their behavior.
Thank you. There's a question in the Q&A from Charlotte Siegel, and a similar question that falls on the same track, specifically about the Uyghurs, and talking about some of the specific ways that I guess DRL has combated against human rights atrocities, such as those Uyghur Muslims in China. And as a sort of follow-up, a question that's perhaps raising the question of some of President Biden's comments about Uyghur Muslims as a different norm, is what the person asking the question at least quotes. the president is saying. So I guess by and large, what are ways the department is able to look at human rights atrocities, and maybe using the Uyghurs as an example?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of atrocities writ large, those are things obviously that our Bureau is tracking, and the so-called Atrocities Prevention Board that I mentioned during the presentation is officially charged with both reporting on countries where atrocities are taking place and more importantly, trying to prevent them. In the case of the Uyghurs, the US government has done a lot. First, in publicizing the plight of the Uyghurs. I've testified a couple of times. The United States has put out various sorts of public documents and statements talking about what's going on in Xinjiang, the region of China where the Uyghurs largely reside. So that's one thing we've done, but we've also taken a number of concrete steps, like economic sanctions imposed on particular individuals in the Chinese government who we deem responsible for the abuses occurring against the Uyghurs, and entities, corporate entities in China that themselves are complicit in the abuses taking place in China. We've imposed visa restrictions on many of these same individuals. Additionally, the Commerce Department within the US government has put in place what are called export controls on a number of the entities, corporate entities, who are complicit in human rights abuses in Xinjiang. This precludes American companies from selling or transferring goods to these entities. And we're in the process of trying to update that list. We also have issued a business advisory to all businesses, warning them of the risks in their supply chain related to Xinjiang. We've similarly provided guidance to businesses in the technology sector about the risks of selling or sharing technology with any entities who also might be complicit in the repression taking place in Xinjiang. So those are some of the things that we've tried to do to address the atrocities there.
Scott, can you talk a little about the tension, for lack of a better word, between the country desks and the work that goes on, in bureaus such as yours?
Yeah.
Within the State Department?
Yes. In any bilateral relationship, there is typically a variety of interests that we may have. Some of them may be commercial. That is, say, we want to invest in a given place, sell goods to that place, or receive goods from that place. There may be security interests. Case in point, in the Philippines right now, the Philippines has a US naval base there, which is absolutely critical to our security in the region. And so that's a very important factor in our relationship with the Philippines. And similarly there, we may want countries to play a role on other key issues. So during the Obama administration, one key objective of President Obama was achieving the Paris Climate Accord, and getting China and India on board with that accord was critical. So there were times in our dealings with China, we may have pulled back from hitting them hard on human rights issues because we needed their cooperation, their support in another area. So there are always those sorts of competing interests which have to be balanced out. That said, almost all American administrations over the long haul do promote the idea that respect for human rights and democracy over the long haul is integral to US interests. So it is always a key factor in any relationship. It just may not be the determinative factor at any particular moment in the relationship.
I'm going to keep asking questions for the moment. In terms of international NGOs, how do you see the work, or what would you like to see happening to support and complement the work of the government? In other words, how can NGOs support and complement that?
Well, NGOs play an absolute critical role in both collecting information about human rights abuses that we may not ourselves be aware of, and frankly, in holding our own feet to the fire, so that if we have, let's say, prioritized other interests in a given relationship, human rights NGO like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch may come to us and say, listen, you're not paying enough attention to the abuses in a given place, and you should be. And lots of times these NGOs will come to us with recommendations about particular things that we should do to elevate attention to human rights in a relationship. Right now, we're very focused on the situation in Burma, called Myanmar by many other countries, which has had a military coup d'etat. There have been hundreds of killings of civilians at this point. There are thousands of civilians now in detention in Myanmar. And we as a government are trying to figure out, what sort of leverage do we have? What sorts of things can we do to possibly get the military junta to rethink what it's doing there? We've already imposed a wide array of economic sanctions. We're looking at more we can do on economic sanctions. And international NGOs often are both sharing information with us about the abuses they're learning about in a given country, but they also will make recommendations to us about how to try to stop those abuses.
Do you find out about individual abuses through the NGOs specifically?
Oh, yes, oftentimes.
Yeah.
Look, we have people in our embassies around the world, no question about it. And every embassy has a human rights officer who is typically a junior diplomat relatively early in their career. And their job is to collect information about the human rights situation in that country. And that officer is also responsible for doing the first draft of our annual human rights report on that country. But one person cannot know about all of the human rights abuses on their own in a given society. So they're tremendously dependent on local NGOs that are tracking abuses, and then on international NGOs that may be coming into and out of that country who are doing reports on particular sorts of abuses. For instance, right now, many of you have probably read about the very serious abuses taking place in Ethiopia. But the Ethiopian government to date has not allowed independent human rights organizations into Tigray, the region where a lot of these abuses are taking place. So most of the information that has been gathered about those abuses has been taken from refugees who are in Sudan, who fled areas where these abuses were taking place. And the collection of that information has by and large been done by NGOs like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others. And then they share those with us. So we don't have the capacity to be everywhere collecting this information ourselves. So we heavily depend on these international NGOs to share with us what they are finding through their investigations into these situations.
And it's something of a follow-up that came through the Q&A. What it says authority, but how can NGOs, or do they sway the actions of the State Department
Oh,
in terms of
absolutely.
their,
Yes, in the same way that other governments don't like to be embarrassed on the international stage, the United States government, particularly since we claim that human rights is important to us as a country and in our foreign policy, where an advocacy group says to us, you failed to pay adequate attention to human rights abuses, or you failed to take the appropriate action, that is something we care about. They're essentially pointing out, they're holding us accountable to our own commitments and saying we're not living up to our commitments. And that definitely does have an impact on our thinking and on our policy.
well, let me ask you one last question, because I know we need to let you go a few minutes early for another meeting. The group we have watching us right now and will be watching us are students. What role do students have in this? Certainly you've watched other student seminars in the past through the Scholars at Risk seminars. I'm sure you are around advocacy work by students. What role do students have in this? I mean, and how would you tell them that what they do matters?
Yeah.
At the same time.
Well, going back to some of the things I said earlier, U.S. students are in places of learning, of education. The job of the institutions you are part of is to raise awareness about any number of issues. So you can play a key role in raising awareness about particular cases or about particular situations involving human rights in a given country. So educating, raising awareness about those cases in your own institutions, I think is very, very important. And then, as I mentioned earlier as well, to collect signatures, to raise multiple voices of concern about the treatment of particular individuals, or how a government is or is not addressing a particular situation, is something that other governments care about. So the extent to which you all as students can band together and demonstrate your collective concern to another government, that can have an impact on that government's thinking.
Thanks. Scott, I'm going to ask you one more question. We have 3 minutes, because I'm guessing that this might be on people's minds, even though I'm not saying it is, and I'm going to ask it more politic, is what is the role of the presidency in terms of shaping like how your office might work? When an administration change, does it have huge effects? Is it
Yeah, well, the president obviously sets the tone, sets the overall policy direction for the executive branch. So when President Biden says human rights and democracy is at the center of US foreign policy, that means something. That means when I am involved in a conversation with, say, a counterpart in the regional bureau, and we're arguing over whether or not we should publicly issue a statement about a particular case or a particular human rights concern, I can point to the president's statement and say, look, at the president and the secretary, for that matter, have indicated that these issues should be taking priority in our diplomatic relationships with other governments. So that helps a great deal. And then the president can do specific things. For instance, he issued a presidential memorandum early in his administration calling on us to elevate attention to human rights abuses against LGBTQI plus individuals. And this was a similar memorandum was issued in the Obama administration. The Trump administration paid some attention to these issues, but did so inconsistently. And so the issuance of that presidential memorandum gives us specific marching orders when it comes to how we're going to work on those particular issues. So there's both general rhetorical guidance and then specific guidance. That said, as I described in my presentation, a lot of what we have to do is mandated by the Congress. So it's inscribed in law the fact that we have to do annual human rights reports on every country in the world, the fact that we have to do separate reports on international religious freedom, the fact that we have to vet all of our assistance to units of security forces. These are things that are required by law, independent of the president, independent of any given administration. So there is a substantial amount of continuity from administration to administration in terms of the basic things that we do day in, day out.
All right, Scott, we'll let you go to your meeting, but your next meeting, but thank you so much. This was really informative. And I presume things like the country reports, and these are all available through the website, through the
Yes, you
DRO
can find
website?
country reports on our website. If you put into Google, country report, U.S. State Department country report on any given country, it should pop up. We are hoping to issue our most recent country reports on events of the past year later this month. So you should be seeing that in the news, and that'll be a good opportunity to get the most up-to-date information the State Department has on the human rights situation on each country in the world.
All right. Well, thanks, Scott. You've been really generous with your time, and appreciate you.
Thanks, Adam,
all
and thank
your
all of
wisdom.
you watching for the work you're doing to advance human rights, be it in a particular case or as to an overall situation. So keep up the good work. We look forward to partnering with you.
Thanks, Scott. Be well.
Take care.